With the conquest of northern Italy, Rome had entered the world stage. We have already had diplomatic tensions with the Carthaginians across the sea for quite some time, but now our slow yet progressing war efforts from 369 to 280 BC against the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia driven them to seek the aid from one great military commander named Pyrrhus of Epirus. Through his leadership, the Roman legions suffered heavy casualties. The Battle of Heraclea, for instance, led to the destruction of Legio Gemina, including the very swordsman Camillus drew his tactical strength from. Many of his ideas had fallen out of fashion by this point too, allowing the Imperator warlord to sack and demolish the southern regions. However, despite continuously winning battles such as this attack against Beneventum, where he additionally defeated Legio Invicta, Pyrrhus' own armies were suffering so many casualties he couldn't occupy the land. He had now returned to Taras, from where he awaited further reinforcements from Greece. In the meantime, the fact that the Republic only had Legio Prima Italica and Victrix to rely upon encouraged the Etruscans to rise up, taking a very valuable tax income. It was more a political quest for greater independence than an outright rebellion, but still a threat. Not to forget the Ligurians of the Po Valley, who ever still sought to pillage our lands. They could both draw away our attention from dealing with Pyrrhus, who would only grow more powerful the longer he lived. How we reacted to this crisis would determine the stance of the Carthaginians, that undoubtedly would intervene if we were to become a threat to their trade empire. However, interacting with the rest of the world wasn't completely hostile. We, for instance, rather quickly improved our relations with the Greeks of Sicily and Transalpine Gaul. The latter would prove to be a vital ally in the future. These many defeats, where the Roman armies were led by notable families, caused the Senate to look elsewhere for leadership, allowing the Cornelii to rise into command. Gnaeus Scipio was given the esteemed honor of leading Legio Prima Italica. He would rather swiftly reinforce the army and march towards the Etruscans, while Decimus Brutus, the man in command of Legio Victrix, guarded Beneventum and the main roads north towards Rome. But instead of seizing their land like the previous generations would have done, Gnaeus Scipio chose a more diplomatic solution by simply subjugating the Etruscans. This way both sides were satisfied with them getting some form of self-governing rule and us protection tribute. Although we may think this situation was quite neglectable, it did serve Pyrrhus greatly by allowing him to muster more men for his army and take back Cosentia for the Greeks. This on the other hand also left Taras vulnerable, meaning this was where Prima Italica was heading. Well, somehow not fast enough, as Pyrrhus forced marched his army into a defensive position, denying an attack. Quick on his feet, Scipio thus redirected his army down to Cosentia, taking it without much of a fuss, and then after that marched for Taras, expecting Decimus Brutus would send his army to reinforce in an attack. Except by this point additional soldiers from Greece had arrived, giving Pyrrhus enough manpower to once again outnumber and engage a Roman army. Taking down the Greek phalanx was hard enough, but with the following elephant charge, the Roman flank broke, leaving the rest of the army in tatters. The only reason the Cornelii family wasn't scorned by this failure was because Gnaeus Scipio somehow managed to outmaneuver their Greek pursuers, using their superior speed to avoid the phalanx, until they were all that was left. Scipio's valor and cunning proved to be vital. Through this heroic victory, he was now able to blame Decimus Brutus' laziness for the initial defeat. He was subsequently replaced by a member of the Julii family. With new blood in command, a coordinated invasion of Taras was initiated, forcing Pyrrhus to retreat. So far in fact that we couldn't chase after him without risking the garrisons breaking the siege afterwards. Nevertheless, after Lucius Scipio, the older brother of Gnaeus Scipio, arrived with reinforcements, the attack was launched in a concentrated attack against the main gate. This also meant Pyrrhus and his cowardly army could sneak back in behind the city walls. Here he would make his last stand. Our superior engineering skills allowed us to bring down their stone walls, which we immediately used to assault the city. However, the deciding factor evolved on the left, where Lucius Scipio, who was a more hands-on kind of guy, led a band of Italic mercenaries over the walls and into the city streets. This would in turn outflank the Epirote defensive positions, bringing us ever closer to victory. Pyrrhus himself tried to stop us, but by this point it was too late. Taras had fallen and the Greeks were officially kicked out of Magna Graecia. A peace was signed shortly thereafter, including the transfer of the island of Corcyra into Roman hands. It was a piece of land that in the future would serve as a vital beachhead in a future war. Unsurprisingly, this costly military victory over Pyrrhus and the Greeks only proved to the Phoenicians that we, the Romans, were too resourceful to be left alive. And so they declared war upon us, starting the First Punic War. The Carthaginian war goal, being the savages that they were, was obviously the destruction of Rome, but for us, simply denying any easy method of doing so would be enough. And for that we had to secure control over the Carthaginian dominated islands. Therefore, Legio Victrix immediately marched south towards Sicily, while Scipio mustered more men for the war effort. He tried to strike a deal with the Syracusans for military access, but despite our commercial ventures, they denied such a request. They clearly had their own interest and schemes in mind. We simply couldn't wait around for the Carthaginians to make their first move, and was thus forced into trespassing through their lands. This preemptive strike against the Sicilian ports was more a distraction than anything else, serving to cloud the Roman vessels transporting Legio Prima Italica over to Corsica. Quite unexpected was the lack of any proper Phoenician military presence. At first we only saw this minor fleet and landing force striking from Africa, nothing compared to what was to come. The voyage over to Corsica was rough. Our only previous experience traversing the seas with an army was over 100 years ago, and nothing had improved since then. But despite the many casualties along the way, taking Alalia was no big deal. We had now made our moves, but now it was time for the Carthaginians to strike. Out of thin air, the Phoenicians' naval presence allowed them to send dozens of ships filled with elite warriors out towards their former island holdings. While on patrol, Legio Victrix was ambushed, losing the entire legion in a single swoop, returning the ports of Sicily back into Carthaginian hands. Only Prima Italica was still standing. Well, not if the Carthaginians could decide, as their leader landed on Sardinia only a few kilometers away from our position. Within short time, Legio Prima Italica would come under heavy pressure, only surviving courtesy of this new invention integrated into the army known as a ballistae. It was brought along to the expedition in the hopes that we could breach the walls of Caralis before any reinforcements could stop us. With the rather unexpected fall of Sicily, as well as basically only half the legion remaining, this seemed highly unlikely. Whereas Scipio either could proceed or face the wrath of the Carthaginian navy, or even the Senate if he made it that far, the choice was clear, except that transports were already on their way. We had lost everything. Following the Carthaginian counterattack, a clear pattern showed the reasons behind our recent failures. The fact that Carthage had uncontested access to travel from Africa to the islands allowed them for quick maneuvering and opened up an option for defeating our armies in detail. Furthermore, Pyrrhus and especially the Carthaginians proved our current army setup was obsolete and lacked the flexibility required to succeed against major nations such as them. This had to be solved and fast. We immediately began constructing a fleet of our own and set researchers to find a way to properly reform our armies. Lucius Scipio, the man who led the charge over the walls during the siege of Taras, was now the only man with military experience. He was granted authority to reinstate the disgraced Legio Gemina only out of necessity, as the Phoenicians and for unknown reasons also the Syracusans marched into Italy. This also meant we couldn't wait for proper Roman units, instead forcing Scipio to rely upon the local subdued Italians, mainly the Samnites, for manpower. These units proved to be highly effective, at least for the more warlike Lucius Scipio, who used every tool in his arsenal to bring down the elephants and slowly envelop the invading Carthaginians. It was a decisive victory which only helped to delay the Carthaginian invasion. Ships were sailing along the coast and an army even threatened to land just outside of Rome. Our extreme lack of Latin manpower and limited funds made it incredibly hard to form a fitting defense. The only proper thing we had was the fleet that at last was ready to be unleashed. The local pirates proved to be the perfect test run, showing the potential of this new inclusion and also how we still had much to learn. This was something the maritime nation didn't want us to wait around for, sailing straight for our position. However, right before clashing with the Carthaginians, we split up the first wave to double team their larger ships and then afterwards board the hostile skirmisher ships, which proved to be exactly what we needed to win the battle. We had just used their own strength against them, although it came at the cost of heavy casualties. Rattled by this surprising victory, we immediately turned to bring down the other invasion force and marched south. Unlike the last offensive, this time we would concentrate our forces in Sicily with naval support. The deciding moment in this war came at Panormus, where the Carthaginians had gathered for one final battle. It was so massive that it consisted of over 16,000 men, the largest battle in our history so far. The Carthaginians immediately put pressure on our troops, mainly on the left, while their right flank on the other hand slowly was gaining ground. It did have support from the sword-wielding marines, who had landed to assist in the battle, making this possible. This basically served to overwhelm that flank, so we slowly could fold on the rest of the army. Most of the Carthaginian reinforcements were cut off by a few Samnite units, who heroically had marched out to do this on their own. Once the main army was dealt with, our remaining troops would help out with this effort, and basically secure full control over Sicily in the process. Through this massive victory, we broke the back of the Carthaginian army. I mean, they did try to send reinforcements, but with us now having a fleet defending the coastline, this was easily disrupted. With us in control of the Tyrrhenian Sea, Corsica and Sardinia soon thereafter fell into Roman hands. Without their islands, we could easily impose a peace treaty heavily leaning in our favor, ending the First Punic War. But in doing so, we only angered the Carthaginians even more. This dispute was far from over. The Samnites, who proved themselves in our time of need, was granted greater independence and would serve as a more crucial part of the army for future conflicts. We would be ready as new improvements on the military was on the way.